Hello, everyone. So, today I'm going to talk a little bit about boundaries and the importance of boundaries, and also clear up some confusion about what boundaries are. So, boundaries are whatever defines us as a person. They are our needs, our desires, our likes, our dislikes, our values. So, what happens is when we have a lack of boundaries, normally this is caused in childhood, right? Either we wasn't taught what our boundaries was with the support and guidance of our parents or caregivers, or we wasn't able to express our boundaries. So either it didn't feel safe to express our boundaries, or when we did try to express our boundaries, we was met with either punishment or shame, or we was ignored. So what we learn to do is to have a lack of boundaries. And this lack of boundaries is very much connected to the people pleasing pattern and the unworthiness pattern. So if you have the people pleasing pattern or the unworthiness pattern, chances are you have unhealthy boundaries. And why boundaries are so important to have and to uphold is because having those boundaries is what determines the types of relationships we enter into and how we hold ourselves accountable in our lives. So, what boundaries are not are barriers or walls. And often, when I'm working with people, there is a huge misunderstanding around what boundaries actually are. So, when we have a boundary, we're basically upholding the thing or how we want to be treated or how we want to live our lives. We uphold it. Boundaries are not about controlling others, right? That's an impossible task. We can never control others, nor should we try, right? But it's about having a boundary and deciding that if someone or something, be it a situation or a relationship, doesn't oversteps that boundary, right? It's our responsibility to express our boundaries and uphold that boundary. So we're not trying to make the other person treat us in a certain way. We're not trying to control someone or a situation, but it's about the consequence, right? If, say, for example, we're in a romantic relationship and one of our boundaries is cheating, right? Cheating never feels good, right? With cheating comes a lot of lying and a lot of sneakiness, and we very quickly lose distrust in the relationship. So, say one of our boundaries is cheating, right? I don't want to be in a partnership or a relationship with someone that cheats. And then say, so first we have to know what our boundary is, right? And that has to be expressed clearly and openly when we meet the person or as the relationship starts to grow, and that's something that we would need to express. And say we're with that person and then there is cheating, right? We can't control the other person from cheating. We can't stop them from cheating, right? If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And actually, it's got nothing to do with us. But in that moment, we have to understand and realize that that's a boundary, that's a value, a need, and a desire. And what are my actions? What decisions and choices and actions am I going to make so that I uphold my own boundary? And that may be looking like having a conversation, that may be taking time away from that relationship, it may be walking away completely from that relationship. What happens when we don't uphold our own boundaries is we become very resentful. So if you know you can feel or have some resentment towards a situation or towards someone in your life, there's a very good chance that you have overstepped your own boundary. And that resentment builds up, and often it can feel like anger as well. Often we have a lot of anger towards someone or a situation, and even ourselves, when we don't uphold our boundaries, because there is almost a violation of what we truly need, what we value, and what we desire. And when we continue to overstep our own boundaries by not taking the necessary actions or choices or decisions based on our boundaries, what happens is we lose self-respect. We lose trust in ourselves, and we start to feel unworthy. And we're creating this because we're overstepping our own boundaries. So one thing that is related to boundaries, I know, is people have an awful lot of fear around having a boundary, setting that boundary, expressing that boundary, and upholding that boundary. Because there is a limiting belief that if I have a boundary and I express it and I uphold it, then I won't have that person, or I won't have people in my life. I will be alone. And that equals being unsafe, unloved, and unliked. But this belief was created, if you like, it was planted like a seed in the mind in childhood, right? And that's a very limited perspective. It's almost like the inner child is frightened and afraid to have a boundary and to express it and uphold it for fear of being abandoned or unloved or unliked. And that equals being unsafe. That equals because in childhood, our whole survival revolves around being safe. Our whole survival revolves around our parents or caregivers loving us, liking us, approving of us, accepting us, and nurturing us, right? When we're babies and little kids, we can't feed ourselves, we can't home ourselves, we can't do very much for our survival. And so having a lack of boundaries is really created in childhood when it wasn't safe, right? And now that belief that was created when we was little carries through into adulthood. And often when I'm working with people, we really have to do a lot of deep inner work to be able to recognize what our boundaries are, right? Because often we're not even aware of what our boundaries are. And we have to do a lot of work around practicing expressing those boundaries in healthy ways, communication, right? So it doesn't feel like a barrier or a wall going up to our partner or whoever it may be that we're expressing this boundary to. Because that can seem as an attack, and then the other person can get very defensive, right? What happens with human nature is we're constantly taking everything so personal. And often when we express a boundary in a way that feels like a barrier, right? I don't want you to do this, right? Let's take the cheating example. If we turn around and say to our partner, I don't want you cheating on me, you shouldn't cheat on me, this hurts me, and XYZ, right? It puts a lot of shame and guilt on the partner, where when we're having that conversation and when we're expressing that boundary, we can say, hey, I'm not okay with my partner cheating on me. That's not the type of relationship I want to enter into or stay into. So I'm going to remove myself from this relationship, and make your decision from there. I'm going to take time away, whatever it might be for you. It's going to look different for everyone. The fear that will come up is that if I set that boundary, then that person's going to leave me. But a lot of the conversations and the work I do with people is to really deeply inquire if having that partnership or that person or that situation in your life, is it worth, right, throwing away or stepping over your boundaries? Does this really bring you true happiness and joy into your life? Does it bring you peace? Right? And what happens is people that also have a lack of boundaries will not be able to absorb and respect and understand when you set a boundary, right? It will seem like a personal attack because in their childhood, they saw boundaries as being, if they had a boundary, they was unsafe, they was unloved, right? So when you set a boundary or express a boundary with someone else that doesn't have good, healthy, strong, clear boundaries, they're going to see that as a personal attack. It may trigger their abandonment wounds. They'll feel unloved and unliked. They're going to fear that you're going to leave them. So it really is about getting really clear on what our boundaries are, and then mastering really the art of expressing those boundaries in ways that don't seem like a personal attack, right? Because we have to understand that we are all coming from our conditioning. We all have different childhood experiences, different wounds, different beliefs, different conditioning, different traumas, right? And so we have to take all of that on board. But what happens is when we have a lack of boundaries, we're not following our North Star, right? We are not living a life that's authentic. And what will happen is we will stay in unhealthy, toxic relationships, or we will stay in relationships with people or situations or experiences that are aligning to the lack of boundaries that we have, right? To that lack of self-respect and self-worth. And when we don't respect ourselves, when we don't trust ourselves, when we don't honor what we truly need and desire and what we're passionate about and what we like and what we don't like, we end up being very unhappy. We end up being filled with resentment and anger and feeling a lack of fulfillment and joy in our life. And it will often feel as if we are constantly trying to please others by having a lack of boundaries. And then every time we don't assert a boundary or express a boundary, that person will keep overstepping it because we're teaching them that that's okay. We are teaching them that whatever they're doing or saying is acceptable, and that we're going to stay around no matter how they treat us or what their behaviors are, and we end up living a life that feels like a lie. We end up living a life that's so disconnected from ourselves, and then in turn we feel so disconnected from others, from our situations, whatever it may look like. So I think when we have that fear arise that I'm really afraid of expressing this boundary, I'm really afraid that this person's not going to like me or love me, or this person's going to leave me, we have to question whether giving up our boundaries for this relationship or this situation is worth it. You know, we are all so desperate for love, approval, to be liked, to be accepted. That desperation ends up us accepting breadcrumbs, right? We end up abandoning ourselves. We end up abandoning the lives we truly want to live and the relationships we want to be in for tiny minuscules of connection and love. And of course, sometimes when we start to set these boundaries, we will start to see the people in our lives that it's benefiting from us not having boundaries, right? If If that person only wants to be friends with us or be in a romantic relationship with us or be in our lives because of our lack of boundaries, then basically you're acting like a doormat. You are acting like a people pleaser just so that you can have that relationship or that connection. And there are so many people in the world. As soon as you start aligning yourself and saying no to things that aren't aligned with your needs, your desires, and your values, and you start saying yes to situations, experiences, and relationships that are in alignment with your values, needs, and desires, you will start to live a more authentic life. Sometimes there is a moment or a period in our lives where old relationships that don't align with us anymore, or situations are dissolving or we're moving away from, right? Or they're ending. And that there can be a time period where we feel quite alone, where we haven't quite aligned or met people that do align, or we haven't had got into, chosen a job that aligns with our values, needs, and desires, or whatever it may look like, right? Boundaries aren't just set within romantic relationships, they're set in all aspects of our life, right? With our friends, with our co-workers, bosses. It's like everything, right? Boundaries are everything. And so I encourage you to get really clear, and often, what feels good? What are your passions? What when you imagine your life, what does it look like? What type of relationships would you like to have? Both romantic, friendship, family, right? How do you like to spend your time? Where do you want to focus your energy? Because that's the most important thing in life. Where we focus our energy and our attention, that's where we're going to see transformation and fulfillment. And often we are focusing our attention from our childhood wounds, from our traumas, through the lens of those limiting beliefs. And we are repeating our own habitual patterns and cycles because of the choices we're making, the decisions we're making, the actions we're taking. And that's all coming from this belief of, if I have boundaries, if I express my boundaries, I'm going to be alone, or I'm not going to be liked or loved or approved of. But once we start to see, and we can do this by looking back at previous relationships or friendships or situations, right? We can actually look back and see the relationships that broke down, right? Or that ended, or that was toxic or unhealthy. Where was I not upholding my boundary? Where did I keep allowing that person to either lie to me or treat me poorly, right? Or where was I saying yes to something out of fear of being unloved or unapproved of, or being alone, right? What was I saying no to when actually that was something that I really wanted to do, right? So this work is about inquiring into our patterns, inquiring into all the layers of conditioning, limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world, but to live a purposeful, passionate, fulfilling life, we have to know what our boundaries are. We have to know what our likes and our desires and our needs and our values are in order to guide us, right? There's so many options for us in the world. And when we say yes to everything just to please people, we end up veering off of the path that truly feels fulfilling for us. I also would like to add that the difference between a barrier and a boundary is that a boundary is something that, like I said, guides us through life. Whereas a barrier is something that, it's like a blockade, right? And of course, if we have had a lack of boundaries in the past and we start to realize the importance of having boundaries, and we start to respect ourselves and trust ourselves and find our self-worth, all of those three things we don't have to actually work on. Self-respect, self-worth, and self-trust comes when we start expressing our boundaries, right? When we start to head in the direction that feels authentic for us, and we trust ourselves to say no to things, people and relationships that don't feel good, and we start to say yes to things that do feel good, that's when we start to trust ourselves. That's when we start to build self-worth and self-trust in making those choices and decisions. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy, because we have to break those patterns. We have to, when those beliefs start to arise, like, oh, I'm really afraid, I have this boundary, I want to express it, but I have a lot of fear. We have to remember that that belief, that limiting belief, is the childhood version of you, right? That's the childhood version of you that's so petrified of being unsafe, that's just trying to survive, that's trying to get fed and watered and loved and nurtured. The difference is, back then, the amount of people you could go to for those things are very, very limited, especially in the West when we don't live in community, right? All of our needs and our desires and our survival is basically solely directed on our parents. It's a lot of pressure, right? And sometimes, most of the time, one parent, especially nowadays, right? So what we have to understand, when that belief is arising that I'm not going to be safe, and we may have the physical sensations in our body arising, right? That all-encompassing fear, right? That feeling of almost being like stuck, right? Or paralyzed, like we can't move, like I want to do this thing, but I'm so frightened. Fear has taken over me, and now I feel stuck. Now I'm procrastinating because of the fear. But we have to remind ourselves that when we was a child, that was because we was very limited on who we had in our life. Now we're adults, right? And there is a world full of people, places, situations, experiences that we can reach out to, that we can align with. So we can comfort and nurture and give, if you like, that inner child version of ourselves the chance to have a boundary, and our adult self can express and exert that boundary, right? That's, we owe it to ourselves to do that, right? We all owe it to ourselves to live with self-respect, self-trust, self-love, right? We all deserve to be able to make choices and decisions that are in alignment with our authentic self. Right? So we have to be that open, loving, patient, caring, if you like, parent or caregiver that maybe we didn't have, right? And we have to reinsure to that inner child self that it's okay, we are safe to have a boundary, we are safe to express that boundary. Okay, so if you are interested in this work, then you can check out the description box, where I invite you to Surrender Immersion. It's a 6-month immersion where we dive deep into all layers of our conditioning, traumas, beliefs, emotional intelligence, boundaries, inner child work. It's really work on recreating healthy patterns that are in alignment with our authentic self, and unraveling our unhealthy patterns that are no longer serving us. So thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.